So we've been talking in sort of general terms about housing problem solving, and you've shared a couple of examples with us, but because it's such a creative and flexible approach, it sometimes feels like it's easier to define it by example. Do you have some other stories that you might want to share?
I would love to. Housing problem solving really has about four components, right? There's prevention, there's that diversion 2 week window prior to entering homelessness, there's rapid exit, which is that 2 week window after, and then there's the sort of outreach. They're already experiencing homelessness, and we're trying to see if there's anything we can do to quickly house them at that point, right? So, in terms of prevention, a lot of the times that we're getting involved, we're trying to help somebody have a conversation with someone where there's either a conflict, right? Or it's something with their landlord where they're having an issue. One of my favorite stories around that was there was a woman who had been renting most of her life with her husband, and then her husband passed away. And in the apartment, the shower broke. And she thought, oh no, I can't afford to fix the shower. I'm just going to leave before the landlord calls me out. I'm going to use my next month's rent on a security deposit somewhere else because I can't afford a security deposit somewhere else and next month's rent. So I'm just going to leave. And so she winds up, talking to the coordinated entry system, and they're like, well, have you spoken to your landlord? Because a lot of apartments, they're responsible for certain repairs. She had no idea, right? That was just something her husband had always interfaced with, right? And so did she have an eviction notice? No. Did she have to leave that month? No. So in our book, right, she's got quite some time, but we were able to step in really early on, help her mediate with her landlord, and navigate that circumstance so that she didn't wind up having trouble or feeling like she had to immediately leave that unit. In terms of diversion, that's where we see the most people who are calling our system in crisis, right? This is where the psychological crisis of being in fight mode, flight mode, or freeze mode is at its heightened point. And so our focus is on de-escalating their mind so that they can have a productive conversation, because they have kept themselves housed for the last 360 days or the last 2 months or the last 2 weeks. They figured it out. So that's why I believe if we're able to de-escalate and have a conversation about what's going on, we might be able to find another option for them. So there was one of the stories I think of for this one, for a diversion, is we had a gentleman who arrived at our shelter, and he wouldn't talk about what had gone on, but after a day or two, he was willing to have a conversation about it. And his roommates had slipped a note under his door telling him he had to be out by that weekend. And he left. He just didn't know how to have a conversation with them and felt very anxious about it and left, right? And, we asked him questions like, can you tell us how you became roommates with this person? Can you tell us what went well in the beginning? Where did things start to go wrong? Can you tell us the story of that relationship? And what we wound up doing is having a conversation with the other roommates and helping him continue to stay in that room that they had not filled yet. And, was it the long-term option? No, they were going to work on finding another roommating arrangement, right? But we helped that person know their rights to where they were and be able to navigate a conflict that they were struggling with. And that was all without additional funding, right? And that doesn't mean it's going to happen in every case. In some cases are going to need money, right? But for those that a conversation will help, we try and be there to help them with those conversations. For rapid exit, right? One of those stories I think of a lot is there was a gentleman in Maine who arrived at a shelter, right? And he's at this shelter and he's talking to the provider, and he sort of just drops, yeah, my mom probably thinks I'm dead. Just casually, right? And, the provider was a mom, and she was just like, wow, if my son was out there and I didn't know if he was safe, I don't know how I'd sleep at night. Like I would worry so much every day, just not knowing. Would it be all right? Would you be willing to sign something so that I could communicate with her just to know that you're safe? You don't have to communicate if you don't want to. I won't get back to you if you don't want to talk about it, but would you mind if I did that? And he said, yeah, that's fine with me. And she found her through an aunt on Facebook, and connected with her and had a conversation. And she was overjoyed to hear that her son was alive and okay and safe and sober at that time, right? And he wound up within 2 weeks being reconnected with her and actually wound up moving back with her, right? Because that's what they both wanted.
That
So,
is so cool.
yeah. So that's the kind of rapid. Does that mean it happens every day? No. But these are stories that like come up all over the place. And I tell you these interesting stories, right? But let me just say, that's because if I told you boring stories, you wouldn't remember them. Most of the conversations you have that are housing problem solving are really boring. What I mean by that is it's somebody calling saying, hey, I'm looking for shelter. And you say, well, I'm happy to talk to you about that. It can be difficult to get into shelter and be in shelter. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about that. But if you just want to talk to me a little bit about your situation, I'd like to see how I can help. Right. And then they tell you for 15 minutes about what's been going wrong with their mom and their brother or their uncle or their roommate. And they rant about it. And you are empathetic and you listen. And then you tell them a little bit about, the process and how it can be really difficult to be in shelter. But we talk about other resources we can connect them to in the meantime, right? Or helping them find their next step or connecting them with a resource that might help them find another job to help them get another place, or a social worker so they have another meeting, or counselor because what they really want is help with their mental health, right? Whatever it is they're interested in. And then they say, okay, well, I guess that makes sense. And that's the resource I'm going to go with. And I'm going to talk to my mom. And then they hang up. Or then they leave your office, right? And that's a really boring story compared to a reconnection with a long lost mom, right? So I just want to refocus that I'm giving you guys really interesting, weird stories that have happened once. But the majority of the time you're interacting with a client, it's going to be those boring cases where they needed help mediating with the landlord. They needed help with a conflict at home. They needed to bring a housing plan in with their roommate on where they were going to go next because this isn't working long term. But those stories are a lot more boring. So I got to bring out my fun ones.